In 1622, an Ottoman sultan was strangled to death, not by a foreign enemy, not by a rival empire, but by his own soldiers. The men who killed him were the same elite corps that had spent nearly 2 centuries terrifying half the known world on the sultan's behalf. That sultan was Osman II. And his death marks something historians consider a turning point, the moment the Ottoman Empire's most effective weapon, institutionalized terror, used for generations to build and secure the empire, began turning on the empire itself. This is the story of how deliberate, calculated fear built one of history's largest empires. And how, over centuries, that same machinery of fear helped hollow it out from the inside. Before we go further, everything in this video is drawn from documented Ottoman history, contemporary chronicles, Ottoman legal codes, and the work of modern historians of the empire. This is not a story about one battle. It's a story about a system, and its names, laws, and dates are all verifiable in the historical record. Terror, as a deliberate instrument of Ottoman statecraft, appears early and by design. When Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople in 1453, he didn't simply defeat an army. Mehmed also formalized one of the most ruthless succession laws in recorded history, the Kanun-i Osmani, issued under his authority, explicitly permitting a new sultan to execute his brothers on taking the throne, justified in the law's own language as necessary for the order of the world. This wasn't an abstract legal formality. It was regularly enforced. When Sultan Mehmed III took the throne in 1595, he had 19 of his brothers executed in a single day, along with several of his father's pregnant concubines, to eliminate every possible rival claim before it could form. This is documented directly in Ottoman court records of the period, not later exaggeration. The logic was brutally simple. Civil wars over succession had devastated other medieval states repeatedly. The Ottomans decided that killing potential rivals immediately, in a single controlled act, was less costly than risking a prolonged war of succession later. Terror, applied early and decisively, was treated as a tool of stability. The same logic extended to how the empire built its most feared military institution, the Janissary Corps. Beginning under Sultan Murad I in the late 14th century and formalized over the following century, the Ottomans developed the Devshirme system, a periodic levy in which Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood as soldiers and administrators with total engineered loyalty to the Sultan alone, cut off from their birth families and any competing local loyalty. The Janissaries became the most feared infantry force in Europe for roughly 2 centuries, disciplined, loyal, and central to Ottoman military dominance from the Balkans to the gates of Vienna. Their reputation alone functioned as psychological warfare, and Ottoman commanders repeatedly used deliberate exemplary brutality against captured enemies and rebellious vassals specifically to discourage future resistance, a documented pattern across numerous campaigns, not an isolated tactic. For roughly 2 centuries, this system worked exactly as designed. Rapid, terror-reinforced expansion, ruthless internal succession management, an elite slave soldier corps loyal only to the throne. The empire grew from a small Anatolian frontier principality into one that stretched from North Africa to the Persian Gulf to the edge of Central Europe. Then the same mechanisms began working against the institution that built them. The Janissaries, originally engineered to have no loyalty beyond the Sultan, gradually developed loyalties of their own, to their own corps, their own economic interests, and increasingly, to their own political power within the capital itself. By the early 17th century, the Janissaries had transformed from the Sultan's personal instrument of terror into an independent political force capable of making and breaking sultans through the same violence they had once used purely on the empire's behalf. Osman II, still a young sultan, attempted to reform and reduce the Janissaries' power and privileges in 1622. In response, the Janissaries rose up, deposed him, and had him strangled, the first time in Ottoman history that a reigning sultan was killed by his own soldiers rather than in battle or through court intrigue. It would not be the last. Sultan Ibrahim I, later in the same century, was deposed and executed in 1648 following a Janissary and clerical uprising, after a reign widely described by contemporaries as erratic. The fratricide law itself, meanwhile, was already producing its own unintended damage. Executing every rival brother on accession sounds stabilizing in theory. In practice, it meant that if a sultan died unexpectedly with no adult heir prepared to rule, the empire could be left with no experienced alternative at all, an entire generation of potential rulers permanently removed by a system built to prevent instability. By the early 17th century, the Ottomans quietly abandoned outright fratricide in favor of a different, less bloody form of control, the kafes or cage, a secluded section of the palace where royal princes who were not the direct heir were confined for life, isolated from military command, education in statecraft, and the outside world, rather than executed outright. This solved one problem and created another. Princes who spent decades confined in isolation, with no practical training in governance or warfare, sometimes ascended the throne with no real preparation to rule at all. Sultan Ibrahim I, the same sultan later deposed and executed in 1648, spent years confined in the kafes before taking power, and contemporary accounts describe a reign marked by erratic decision-making and instability, a pattern historians directly connect to the psychological toll of that confinement. The instrument that had prevented one kind of chaos, succession war, had, over generations, helped produce a different kind of institutional weakness, sultans with no meaningful preparation to govern the empire they inherited. By the 18th century, the Janissaries had become something close to a hereditary self-interested political class of their own, resistant to any military reform that threatened their status or privileges, even reforms the empire desperately needed to keep pace with rapidly modernizing European armies. When Sultan Selim III attempted serious military modernization in the early 1800s, introducing the Nizam-i-Sedid, a new European-style army meant to eventually replace Janissary dominance, the Janissaries rose up again. Selim III was deposed in 1807 and murdered the following year, another sultan killed at the hands of the very corps their predecessors had built specifically to protect the throne. The final reckoning came under Sultan Mahmud II. In June 1826, in an event Ottoman history remembers as the auspicious incident, Mahmud moved directly against the Janissary corps itself, using loyal artillery units to crush a Janissary uprising in Constantinople with overwhelming decisive force. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in the crackdown, and the corps was formally abolished, nearly 450 years after Janissary units had first been formed to serve as the Sultan's most feared and loyal weapon. So here is the full shape of the story. Terror built the Ottoman Empire in a very specific documented way: fratricide to prevent succession wars, an engineered slave soldier corps with no outside loyalty, and calculated brutality used deliberately as psychological warfare against enemies and rebels. For roughly 2 centuries, this combination helped produce one of history's largest and most durable empires. And then, across the following 2 centuries, the exact same instruments, a corps built to have no independent loyalty developing one anyway, a succession law meant to prevent chaos instead starving the empire of experienced heirs, and a palace culture built around eliminating rivals through violence turning that same violence against the sultans themselves, became one of the central sources of the empire's long internal instability. It's important to be precise about what this does and doesn't explain. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse in 1826, or even in the following decades. It persisted for nearly another century, finally dissolving only after the First World War, in 1922, brought down eventually by a combination of nationalism, external military defeat, and a wider collapse of European empires generally, not by the Janissary crisis alone. What the history of internal Ottoman terror does explain is something narrower but still significant: why an empire built on rapid, decisive, centralized control became, for long stretches of its later history, unusually resistant to reform, prone to sudden violent swings in leadership, and slower than its European rivals to modernize when modernization mattered most. Here is the irony worth sitting with. The Ottomans built an empire on the idea that swift, overwhelming, centralized violence prevents instability. For a while, that idea worked better than almost any other state in the world had managed. But a system built entirely around eliminating threats through force eventually runs out of external enemies to apply that force to, and when it turns inward on its own sultans, its own princes, its own soldiers, the very efficiency that built the empire becomes the mechanism slowly wearing it down from within. Terror is an effective tool for seizing and holding power quickly. History rarely rewards the states that never learn how to govern without it. This has been the story of terror, the Ottoman Empire, and the machinery that built it, and eventually, strained it from within.